During the time when the Buddha was still present in this world, a great king solemnly organized a magnificent offering ceremony to honor the Blessed One and the Sangha, hoping to cultivate vast blessings for all beings throughout his kingdom. An old woman living in deep poverty by begging for food heard about the royal offering ceremony and immediately felt profound joy arise within her heart, wishing sincerely to contribute even the smallest virtuous cause in order to plant wholesome roots with the 3 jewels. Though her life was so destitute that she possessed nothing of value, the old woman still managed to beg for a few beans meant for her own meal, then willingly endured hunger so she could offer them with complete sincerity and reverence. When the old woman arrived at the city gate, hoping to enter the great assembly and present her humble offering, the guards refused to let her pass. Yet she remained outside the gates with unwavering devotion, directing her heart toward the Buddha in the spirit of generosity. At that moment, while receiving alms inside the royal palace, the Buddha, through his pure wisdom vision, clearly perceived the old woman's wholehearted sincerity and silently used his spiritual power to cause those simple beans to appear within the bowls of the monks amidst the solemn ceremony. During the meal, the king noticed that among the luxurious delicacies there suddenly appeared an ordinary dish of beans, and dissatisfaction arose in his mind as he reproached the royal cook for what he believed was a careless mistake during such an important occasion. The Buddha gently stopped him and explained that the beans were not the fault of the cook, but were instead the sacred offering of a poor old woman standing outside the city walls with a heart of extraordinary purity and devotion. Hearing the Buddha's words, the king finally understood that the impoverished woman had willingly given up her own meager meal so she could contribute a small amount of food to the ceremony with a sincerity rarely found in this world. After the meal had ended, the Buddha calmly told the king that although the royal ceremony had been conducted with immense grandeur and lavish offerings, its merit still did not equal the heartfelt devotion of the old beggar woman. The king was deeply astonished upon hearing this, and respectfully placed his palms together, asking the Blessed One how only a few tiny beans from a poor woman could create greater merit than the offerings of a mighty ruler. The Buddha compassionately explained that the king had used the wealth of the royal treasury to make his offerings, and therefore never truly experienced sacrifice or deprivation, whereas the old woman had to endure hunger in order to offer those few beans. Because the old woman gave not merely food, but her entire sincere heart and profound sacrifice through her act of generosity, the merit born from her offering became immeasurably noble, surpassing all luxurious gifts that arose merely from worldly abundance. From that story, the Buddha continued teaching profound Dharma to both the king and the old woman, helping everyone present realize the truth that the true value of generosity lies within sincerity of heart, rather than the amount of material wealth offered. A sincere practitioner walking the path of truth should cultivate generosity with compassion and purity as the foundation. For even the smallest offering, when born from genuine sincerity, can still create immeasurable merit and blessings. Just as a poor person possessing only a single bowl of rice may still joyfully share part of it with another suffering soul who is hungry and cold like themselves, such an act of kindness is truly precious within this selfish world. At times, the generosity of the poor carries deeper meaning than the charity of the wealthy, because they give from the very place of their own hardship, sacrifice, and silent endurance. People in this world often believe they should wait until becoming wealthy before beginning to do good deeds. Yet few realize that impermanence can arrive at any moment, and the future may never unfold as they hope. If one endlessly waits until having abundance before awakening the heart of generosity, then an entire lifetime may pass while the soul remains spiritually poor, never planting seeds of blessings for oneself or future generations. There is another story about a Brahmin who owned a milk cow, and each day could collect only a small amount of milk, barely enough to sustain his humble and simple family life. One day, he heard that making offerings to the Sangha during the full moon observance ceremony would bring immense merit and blessings. And because of this, the wish to perform a virtuous deed began to arise within him. He thought to himself that the monks were so numerous, while he possessed only a little milk each day. So how could he possibly make a worthy offering? And thus, he decided to save the milk over a long period of time. From then onward, he stopped using the milk each day and carefully stored it away, hoping that after many days he would gather enough to make a grand offering and thereby receive even greater blessings. When a neighbor saw this behavior, he laughed gently and said that milk could not remain forever inside the cow without being drawn out, and if one truly wished to practice generosity, then even offering a little each day was already precious. The neighbors advised him that good deeds should be practiced immediately, when wholesome intentions first arise, rather than delayed through endless calculations, because opportunities to do good in life are as fragile as morning dew before the wind. Yet even now, many people constantly wish to perform virtuous deeds while endlessly waiting for perfect conditions, waiting for wealth or ideal circumstances. And in the end, they pass through life without ever truly giving anything at all. Long ago, there was also a wealthy elder who was extremely stingy, and throughout his entire life, he had never willingly shared even the smallest thing with anyone, causing his heart to become increasingly dry and tightly attached to material wealth. The Buddha wished to guide and transform this man, so he instructed Venerable Sariputta to visit and teach him about the merit of generosity, in hopes of helping him understand the true value of sharing in human life. Venerable Sariputta used gentle and compassionate words to explain the noble benefits of generosity. Yet the wealthy elder worried only about losing food and wealth, so he hurriedly drove the venerable monk away from his home. Understanding that the man's attachment to stinginess was deeply rooted, Venerable Sariputta returned and respectfully informed the Buddha that it would be extremely difficult to awaken goodness within such a person through ordinary advice alone. Afterward, the Buddha sent Venerable Maudgalyayana to guide him instead, hoping to use spiritual powers and wisdom to open the consciousness of the elder who remained trapped within greed and miserliness. Venerable Maudgalyayana displayed miraculous abilities and used many skillful teachings to help the man understand that worldly wealth is temporary illusion, while merit and virtue are the only treasures that follow a person through countless lifetimes. Yet the wealthy elder still refused to believe, and even suspected that the venerable monk was using supernatural powers merely to obtain his possessions. So he continued to nurture doubt and closed his heart to the true teachings. Finally, the Buddha personally came to the elder's house with boundless compassion, wishing to free him from the painful chains of greed and attachment that bind human beings within this impermanent world. When the wealthy elder beheld the majestic appearance and radiant compassion of the Blessed One, deep reverence suddenly arose within him, and he respectfully bowed before inviting the Buddha into his home to hear the sacred Dharma. The Buddha sat down calmly and gently asked whether the elder would be willing to practice the 5 great acts of generosity. And though his words were soft, they carried profound wisdom that gradually soothed the listener's restless heart. The wealthy elder replied that he could not even perform a small act of giving. So how could he possibly carry out the 5 great forms of generosity the Buddha had just described? The Buddha smiled with kindness, and then asked further whether the elder would be willing to practice those acts if they required no expenditure of wealth at all, but only the maintenance of a righteous and wholesome heart. Hearing this, the wealthy elder began listening attentively, because he believed these teachings perhaps would not cause him to lose the possessions he had spent his whole life desperately clinging to. The Buddha then explained that the first great act of generosity is refraining from killing, learning to love all living beings, and refusing to inflict suffering upon any life within this world. After hearing this, the wealthy elder thought that such a practice required no money at all, so he quickly answered that he was capable of doing it and saw nothing particularly difficult about it. Next, the Buddha taught about moral precepts such as refraining from stealing, avoiding wrongful conduct, speaking truthfully, and not consuming intoxicants that cloud the mind and cause human beings to lose their conscience and wisdom. Each time the Buddha asked, the wealthy elder replied that he could indeed practice those teachings, because he gradually realized that none of them required the loss of wealth he had always feared before. The Buddha then explained more deeply the immeasurable merit and blessings gained by those who faithfully uphold the 5 pure precepts, for they form the foundation that allows human beings to live peacefully and cultivate lasting wholesome karma. A person who faithfully keeps the 5 precepts not only brings peace and safety to themselves, but also offers the gift of fearlessness to all living beings through the goodness and purity of their own way of life. After hearing those precious words filled with compassion and wisdom, the wealthy elder felt immense joy arise within his heart, and the seeds of stinginess gradually dissolved as the wish to practice generosity and cultivate true blessings began to awaken within him. Once, after listening to the Buddha's teaching, a wealthy elder developed the sincere intention to offer the Blessed One a bundle of cloth as an act of devotion and reverence. Yet strangely, within his storehouse there existed only precious silks and luxurious fabrics, and not a single coarse or ordinary cloth as he had originally intended to give away. He thought to himself that he would simply choose one ordinary bundle to offer, so he could feel relieved. But the moment he pulled out a single roll of cloth, all the other fabrics in the warehouse became tangled together and could no longer be separated. Seeing such a strange occurrence, the wealthy elder stood there confused for a long while, before finally deciding to bring the entire store of cloth to offer the Buddha as a way of letting go of the greed and attachment he had carried for so many years. The Buddha clearly perceived that within the elder's heart there still remained hesitation between regret and joy. So with great compassion, he taught that when a person performs good deeds without full determination, the merit created can never become completely perfect and fulfilled. The Buddha then recounted that in ancient times the heavenly king had fought many battles against the asuras, yet could never truly achieve victory because doubt and hesitation still lingered within his mind. Only when his heart became firm and unwavering, no longer retreating before hardship and obstacles, did the heavenly king gain enough strength to completely defeat the asuras and restore peace to the heavens and all living beings. Hearing the Buddha speak in such a way, the wealthy elder understood that before him stood the fully enlightened one, who could see deeply into the hidden thoughts of all beings. And because of this, his faith and reverence grew stronger than ever before. Afterward, the Buddha continued using gentle and compassionate words to explain the wondrous Dharma, helping the wealthy elder open the eye of wisdom and attain the very first stage upon the sacred path toward liberation. On the following day, a demon transformed itself into the exact appearance of the Buddha and came to the wealthy elder's home in order to test whether his faith and wisdom had truly become stable and mature. At that time, the wealthy elder had not yet attained the ability to perceive another being's mind, so he did not realize that it was merely a demon in disguise. And upon seeing the familiar appearance of the Buddha, he joyfully and respectfully invited it inside. The false Buddha then declared that the teachings given the previous day were incorrect and told the elder to abandon moral discipline and act in the opposite way if he truly wished to follow ultimate truth. Upon hearing those contradictory words, doubt immediately arose within the wealthy elder's heart, because although the figure looked exactly like the Buddha, its speech completely opposed the compassionate teachings and noble principles the Blessed One had previously taught. He reflected carefully and realized that true Dharma could never change in such unstable and contradictory ways. So he firmly refused to believe the false teachings, no matter how perfectly the outer appearance resembled the Buddha himself. Seeing that the elder's heart remained steady and unshaken before temptation and deception, the demon finally revealed its true form and admitted that it merely wished to test whether his faith and wisdom had genuinely matured. Through this story, we can understand that those who have truly realized even a portion of the truth will not easily be deceived by false teachings, no matter how sacred or noble the speaker may appear outwardly. True faith within Buddhism must always walk together with clear wisdom, so that one may distinguish between teachings that accord with the true Dharma and those that merely lure people toward suffering and false paths. If a practitioner believes blindly without using wisdom and discernment, it becomes very easy to fall onto the wrong path and later create heavy karma and painful consequences for oneself. For this reason, the Buddha always advised his disciples to use wisdom as the lamp that illuminates their path, accepting only teachings that accord with karma and truth, rather than believing merely because of reputation or outward appearances. Even if certain words are written within sacred scriptures or spoken by individuals holding high positions and great honor, if those teachings contradict goodness and virtue, then a wise person must still examine them carefully before accepting them. Like the wealthy elder in this story, although the demon assumed the exact form of the Buddha and used skillful speech to tempt him into breaking the precepts, he still remained firmly grounded in faith toward the true Dharma. It is precisely this kind of faith, founded upon wisdom and careful contemplation, that is called right faith, the foundation that prevents practitioners from losing the genuine path toward liberation. On the other hand, blindly believing and accepting every teaching without thoughtful reflection is merely superstition, and superstition has never truly led anyone toward awakening and liberation. On another occasion, within the monastery, there appeared a monk whose body was covered with painful sores and ulcers, with foul-smelling blood and pus flowing from his wounds, causing everyone to feel uncomfortable and fearful whenever they came near him. Seeing that the monk lay alone in agony, the Buddha instructed the other monks to take turns caring for him, bathing him, and applying medicine so that his body might recover more quickly. Although they obeyed the Buddha's command, many monks still could not endure the terrible odor coming from the diseased body, so they only visited briefly before quickly leaving the room with expressions of discomfort and hesitation. When the Buddha witnessed this, he personally entered the sick room and used his own compassionate hands to carefully bathe and lovingly care for the suffering monk. Through the attentive care and boundless compassion of the Blessed One, the monk's illness gradually improved, his body slowly recovered, and his mind also became far more peaceful than before. The disciples who witnessed this scene were deeply moved and respectfully asked why the Buddha, the most honored being within the three realms, would personally care for someone whose body was so foul and diseased. They believed such work could easily have been assigned to others, and wondered why the Buddha himself needed to humble his body and labor for a sick and pitiful monk in such a way. The Buddha calmly explained that among all beings there exist deep karmic connections carried across countless lifetimes, and therefore, whenever one sees another suffering, one should awaken compassion and sincerely help them with all one's heart. Then the Buddha recounted that countless ages ago there existed a kingdom where criminals were punished by beating with rods, and within the royal court there served an execution officer named Nu Ba Chu. This man possessed great physical strength and authority, so he often abused his power to oppress innocent people, and anyone who bribed him with money would receive only light punishment, no matter how serious the crime might be. In contrast, those who were poor and unable to offer bribes were beaten mercilessly, even for minor offences, suffering terrible pain and severe bodily injuries beneath his cruelty. One day, an innocent lay devotee was falsely accused and brought forward for punishment, and knowing he had no money to bribe the officer, he could only sincerely beg to be beaten lightly so he might preserve his life. When Nu Ba Chu heard the man's sincere plea, compassion unexpectedly arose within his heart, and on that day he struck very gently, without causing severe injury as he had done during previous punishments. The Buddha explained that the officer who once wielded the rod was the very same monk now suffering from painful sores, while the innocent lay devotee from long ago had in fact been the Buddha himself in a previous life. Because Nu Ba Chu had inflicted suffering upon many people in the past, he now experienced the karmic result of painful illness and bodily torment. Yet because he once showed a small measure of compassion toward the Buddha, he was now personally cared for by the Blessed One. Through this karmic connection, the Buddha wished to teach that every good and evil action performed by human beings never truly disappears, but silently ripens into consequences that will eventually return to the very person who created them. In ordinary life as well, there are countless people silently enduring suffering within their families, and though they may face injustice and bitterness, they continue to endure patiently because deep karmic bonds from past lives still remain unresolved. Some people possess enough strength to leave behind their painful circumstances, yet they still quietly swallow their tears and remain in order to repay the karmic debts of past connections, understanding that every encounter in life unfolds according to the profound law of cause and effect governing heaven and earth. There are people in this life who silently endure countless bitterness within their families and society, and even they themselves sometimes cannot understand why they still remain unable to leave behind such painful circumstances and seek freedom for their own hearts. Though they repeatedly wish to escape suffering and sorrow, deep within their minds there always seems to be an invisible force holding them back, causing them to continue enduring and silently carrying their burdens as though some karmic debt still remains unpaid. These are the karmic bonds formed across countless past lives that continue to bind human beings together, causing them to meet again in order to repay old debts of gratitude and resentment until those karmic connections finally come to an end. The story of the Buddha personally caring for the monk afflicted with painful sores clearly illuminates the profound truth that every wholesome or unwholesome karmic seed planted in life never truly disappears, even if it begins from only a single fleeting thought. Though Nu Ba Chu in the past often caused suffering to others, in one rare moment he allowed compassion to arise and lightly punished an innocent man. And because of that small act of kindness, he still received a rare blessing amidst suffering in this present life. It was precisely because of that tiny, wholesome cause that when he later endured the painful body of disease as a monk, he was personally cared for by the Buddha himself with boundless compassion beyond compare. This reveals that between human beings, there always exist invisible karmic ties of extraordinary depth, causing some people to endure hardships that others could never possibly bear within this lifetime. If one truly understands the wondrous law of karma and retribution, then every practitioner must remain mindful and careful in each thought, word, and action, so as not to create further unwholesome karma that will bring prolonged suffering in the future. There is another story which tells that long ago there lived a king who loved hunting and would often lead his soldiers deep into the forests, seeking entertainment amidst the wild mountains and untamed wilderness. During one such journey, the king encountered a hermit quietly meditating beneath a great tree, radiating profound serenity and an extraordinary sense of peace and freedom from worldly attachment. The king ordered his soldiers to bring the hermit back to the royal palace and forced him to become a singer for royal banquets, because the sacred Sanskrit chanting of the ascetic possessed an unusually captivating and beautiful sound. The hermit knew nothing of worldly singing and devoted himself only to reciting sacred scriptures. Yet each time he chanted, his deep and solemn voice caused everyone who heard it to feel a strange calmness settling within their hearts. From that day onward, whenever grand feasts or important receptions for foreign guests were held within the palace, the king would summon the hermit to chant scriptures in order to make the gatherings feel more noble and magnificent. One day, a wealthy merchant from a distant land arrived and offered precious jewels to the king in hopes of receiving permission to trade goods freely within the kingdom under royal protection. The king became greatly pleased and organized a magnificent banquet to honor the merchant. And, as usual, he summoned the hermit to chant sacred verses during the feast to entertain the distinguished guest. When the merchant heard the profound chanting filled with liberating meaning flowing from the hermit's voice, he was deeply astonished, because he realized this was no ordinary man, but a genuine spiritual practitioner of great virtue and realization. After the banquet ended, the wealthy merchant brought forth gold and silver to ransom the hermit from the royal palace, wishing to help him regain freedom and return to his peaceful life of cultivation within the mountains and forests. At first, the king refused, because he loved the hermit's chanting too greatly. Yet after much bargaining, he finally agreed to release him in exchange for an enormous amount of gold. The wealthy merchant felt immense joy and respectfully bowed before saying that from that moment onward, the hermit was finally liberated from the fate of being forced to serve as a singer within the luxurious royal palace. Unexpectedly, at that very moment, the hermit suddenly rose into the sky using spiritual powers, causing the king, officials, and gathered people to stare upward in awe, fear, and reverence. Standing peacefully in mid-air, the hermit gently explained that the merchant was not truly redeeming him, but was instead repaying a karmic debt carried from many lifetimes ago. He recounted that countless ages earlier, the present king had once been a humble vegetable seller, and the merchant had come to buy produce but lacked enough money to fully pay his debt. The vegetable seller refused to allow payment on credit, so the hermit in that former life stepped forward out of simple kindness and agreed to guarantee the debt without expecting anything in return. Unexpectedly, the debtor never repaid what he owed, and through the passage of time and the accumulation of karmic conditions across many lifetimes, that tiny unpaid debt eventually became the enormous amount of gold in the present day. Because the hermit had once guaranteed that debt, he later experienced the karmic consequence of being trapped within the royal palace for many long years as part of an unavoidable karmic entanglement. After hearing this extraordinary story of karma and cause and effect, both the king and the merchant became deeply shocked and awakened, and they developed sincere faith in the three jewels while vowing to live virtuously in order to transform old karma. Through this story, we can clearly see that every wholesome or unwholesome seed planted within life gradually grows over time before ripening into corresponding karmic results without even the slightest error or exception. A tiny debt that once seemed insignificant can, through countless lifetimes, still create enormous karmic consequences that force people to meet again in order to settle unfinished karmic connections from the distant past. For this reason, the ancient sages often taught that although one plants only a single small seed, when the time of fruition arrives, it may produce countless sweet fruits or bitter fruits, according to the wholesome or unwholesome karma one has created. Those who truly understand the law of karma would never dare deceive others or avoid repaying debts, nor would they recklessly guarantee matters lacking wisdom and clarity, because they know karmic connections can continue across many lifetimes. There was also another hermit who lived deep within the mountains and forests, and because he possessed an intense fear of snakes, he often built his meditation hut high above the ground while sitting in constant anxiety and vigilance. Whenever he meditated for long periods, he would often become drowsy because his body and mind had not yet been fully disciplined, and therefore many obstacles and delusions still prevented his wisdom from truly awakening. The heavenly beings observed this and wished to awaken him, so each time he nodded off, they loudly warned that a poisonous snake was crawling nearby, causing the hermit to jump up in terror and search frantically all around him. He hurriedly lit a lamp and looked everywhere, but could never find any snake at all. So he returned to meditation, only to fall asleep once again, because his mindfulness remained weak and unfocused. The heavenly beings continued shouting many times in this manner, until the hermit finally became angry and complained that celestial beings should not lie merely to mock a practitioner meditating alone within such a quiet place. Hearing this, the heavenly beings laughed gently and replied that within his own body there already existed 4 dangerous, poisonous snakes. So why did he not contemplate them instead of endlessly fearing snakes outside himself. Upon hearing those words, the hermit suddenly awakened and began deeply contemplating the body composed of the four great elements of earth, water, wind, and fire, realizing that it was merely a temporary and impure combination within this impermanent world. He came to understand that throughout countless lifetimes, he had created immeasurable karma because of attachment to this body, and had therefore wandered endlessly within birth and death without ever attaining true liberation. The more deeply he contemplated, the more clearly the hermit realized the truths of suffering, emptiness, and non-self, causing his mind to gradually release all attachment toward his fragile physical body. Near dawn that very morning, because his wisdom had fully blossomed into completion, the hermit attained the state of arhatship and completely escaped the bondage of birth and death that had bound him throughout countless lifetimes. People in this world all fear poisonous snakes because they can take away a human life within moments. Yet, according to the Buddha's teaching, the four elements within the body are truly the most terrifying poisonous snakes of all. It is precisely the endless conflict among these four elements that gives rise to illness, pain, and aging, silently destroying the human body day after day and hour after hour without anyone being able to escape. Yet, because beings become excessively attached to this temporary body, they continue creating countless evil deeds, competing and struggling against one another, while sinking endlessly within the cycle of birth and death without ever finding liberation. No matter how dangerous poisonous snakes in the world may be, they can harm only a single lifetime, while attachment to the body, together with greed, hatred, and delusion within the mind, are the true causes that have condemned beings to suffering throughout immeasurable ages until now. Throughout immeasurable lifetimes, because beings have mistaken this impermanent body of four elements as their true self, they have been born and died countless times within suffering, without ever fully awakening from the endless cycle of samsara. If one calmly contemplates deeply enough, it becomes clear that this body contains nothing that can truly be called I or mine, for everything exists only through temporary causes and conditions within this impermanent world. Hair, hands, feet, blood, flesh, skin, and all the impure substances hidden within the body are merely separate forms of decaying matter, and none of them are truly worthy of human attachment or obsession. Even if one claims that all these temporary parts combined together form a permanent self, such a belief is still mistaken, because once impermanence arrives, no one can preserve this body from aging, decay, and destruction forever. This present body is no different from clouds drifting across empty space, or an illusory dream passing through the long night, appearing for a moment before vanishing again, while human beings mistakenly cling to it as something real. Because of deluded attachment to the body, beings throughout countless lifetimes continue sinking within the ocean of suffering, enduring endless pain, separation, hatred, and sorrow, like intoxicated dreamers unable to awaken from from an endless illusion. This body is itself the gathering place of sickness, aging, and death. Yet, because of attachment to it, human beings commit countless unwholesome deeds and continue falling ever deeper into the cycle of birth and death. When life finally ends, the body merely becomes decaying flesh and scattered bones, returning to dust. And there remains nothing truly worthy of craving or treasuring as a precious possession within this world. The hermit from long ago, through the reminders of the heavenly beings, turned inward to contemplate deeply upon the selfless nature of the body. And from that moment, he no longer remained attached to physical form or controlled by fear, sorrow, and emotional disturbance. When the mind no longer clings to the temporary body as something real, wisdom gradually shines forth. Afflictions dissolve away, and the path toward liberation becomes clearly visible before the sincere practitioner. Because the hermit fully realized the truths of impermanence and non-self, he gently crossed the threshold of awakening and attained a peace and freedom that ordinary people can scarcely comprehend.
As practitioners learning the Buddha's teachings amidst this world filled with suffering and constant change, each of us should regularly return inward to examine the true nature of our own body and mind. If awakening does not arise soon, then human beings will endlessly chase after the joys and sorrows, gains and losses connected to this fragile body, continuing to create karma and suffer within samsara without end. There is another story which tells that long ago there lived a king who possessed profound faith in the law of karma, always treating his people with compassion and generously helping others without ever refusing anyone in need. The king also guided his people according to the 10 wholesome deeds, and because of this, the entire kingdom flourished in peace, while the citizens lived stable and prosperous lives filled with deep love and admiration for their ruler's virtue.
Meanwhile, the neighboring king, consumed by greed for power, constantly waited for an opportunity to invade, and, seeing that the compassionate ruler paid little attention to military strength, he eventually launched an attack with his armies. The ministers unanimously begged the king to send troops into battle to protect the nation and preserve the kingdom. Yet the king gently refused, because he did not wish for war to plunge the people into misery and suffering. He declared that the royal throne was merely an external possession, while the lives and peace of the people were far more precious, and therefore he would rather sacrifice himself than spill blood for the sake of power and authority. The king instructed his ministers to remain behind and protect the citizens, while he quietly departed from the palace alone and disappeared deep into the mountains and forests so the nation could avoid the tragedy of war. After wandering through the wilderness for many days, the king unexpectedly encountered a poor Brahmin walking wearily along the forest path with a face filled with sorrow, exhaustion, and despair. The two greeted each other respectfully, and the king kindly asked where the Brahmin had come from and why he appeared so burdened and distressed while traveling alone through such a remote wilderness. The Brahmin replied that he had journeyed from a distant land, hoping to meet the compassionate king renowned for generosity, wishing to ask for a small amount of wealth to save his impoverished family from desperate hardship. Hearing this, the king smiled gently and revealed that the very ruler the Brahmin had been searching for was none other than himself. And he then explained how he had abandoned the throne in order to spare the people from war. As soon as the Brahmin heard those words, he collapsed to the ground in despair, because after enduring such a difficult journey, all his hopes for saving his family now seemed completely shattered. The king quickly lifted him up, offered him cool water to drink, and softly asked why hearing such a story had caused him such overwhelming grief and hopelessness. The Brahmin answered through trembling tears that the whole world praised the king as a ruler of immense kindness and generosity, which was why he had travelled such a great distance seeking help for his suffering family. Yet now, upon finally meeting the king, he discovered that the ruler himself had become an exile without shelter or support, leaving him convinced there was no longer any hope of rescuing his family from poverty and starvation. After hearing those sincere words, the king remained silent in deep contemplation for a very long time, before finally speaking gently and assuring the Brahmin that he still possessed a way to help him obtain wealth and security. The Brahmin looked utterly confused and asked how a king now living in exile could possibly save him from the misery and poverty crushing his life. The king explained that although the new ruler had already seized the throne, he had not yet captured him, and therefore the usurper still lived in fear and anxiety about future rebellion and unrest within the kingdom. Because of this, the king instructed the Brahmin to bind him with ropes and bring him back to the capital, assuring him that the new ruler would certainly reward him richly enough to transform his life and rescue his family from suffering. Upon hearing those words, the Brahmin became deeply horrified, tears streaming down his face as he repeatedly refused, because he could not bear the thought of exchanging such a compassionate and righteous king for material wealth. The king gently comforted him by explaining that death comes sooner or later to all human beings, and therefore, if this body could help even one suffering person escape misery, then such a sacrifice would already make life meaningful. He continued by saying that even if he remained alive, hidden within the mountains, this body would eventually decay and perish without benefiting anyone. So it would be far better to use his very life to save someone standing at the edge of despair. After being persuaded many times through the king's sincere compassion, the Brahmin finally agreed with great reluctance to bind him with ropes and lead him back to the capital before the new ruler. When the new king saw the former ruler brought before him, he became immensely delighted and lavishly praised the Brahmin for helping remove the greatest fear that had burdened his heart for so long. He then asked how it had been possible to capture such a virtuous king while he remained hidden deep within the dangerous mountains and forests. The Brahmin lowered his head humbly and replied that he possessed no special ability whatsoever and that everything had happened only because the former king was so compassionate and loving that he willingly sacrificed himself to save a poor man like him. The Brahmin then recounted the entire story of meeting the king within the deep forest, together with the ruler's compassionate words and noble sacrifice, leaving the entire royal court silent and deeply moved. After hearing the story, the new king became overwhelmed with shame, tears filling his eyes as he hurried down from the throne and personally removed the ropes binding the former ruler before all the gathered officials. With great emotion, he declared that the one truly worthy of being king was a ruler of immense compassion, who always placed the welfare of the people first, while he himself was merely a greedy and violent man, driven by lust for power and conquest. The new king then respectfully invited the former ruler to return and govern the kingdom once more, while also vowing from that day onward to correct his own wrongdoings and maintain everlasting peace and friendship between their lands. The endless current of fame and material gain has silently imprisoned the human soul throughout countless generations. And the more civilization advances, the tighter the chains of ambition and desire seem to bind the hearts of people. Whether wealthy and powerful or poor and struggling, most people in this world still find it difficult to attain true peace and freedom. Because within their hearts, they remain endlessly pulled and tormented by desires for wealth, status, and recognition. If human beings truly wish to free themselves from the chains of fame and profit, they must first learn to let go of greed, for insatiable craving is the very root from which all suffering and affliction arise in this life. Because the Buddha wished to guide all beings toward liberation, he constantly taught the practice of contentment, the reduction of desires, and the cultivation of generosity, in order to gradually uproot selfishness and greed within oneself. Many people in this world still practice charity and generosity, yet most do so merely hoping to obtain greater blessings and rewards in the future, rather than sincerely wishing to abandon attachment and craving within their hearts. If one gives while still secretly hoping to receive greater benefits in return, then such actions merely plant causes for future blessings and have not yet become the true letting go that leads toward complete liberation. A person capable of relinquishing power and status in order to yield them to others is already exceedingly rare within this world filled with struggle and competition, much less someone willing to sacrifice even their own life for the sake of saving others. From ancient times until now, those capable of regarding fame and wealth lightly while sacrificing themselves for the benefit of others have always been extraordinarily rare, because such conduct lies far beyond the capacity of an ordinary mind still deeply attached to the self. The compassionate king from the previous story was in truth one of the Buddha's former lives, a being who had already stepped beyond the bondage of power, authority, and worldly gain since immeasurable ages ago. For a fully enlightened being, even life itself is not clung to. So how could worldly wealth, fame, and status ever possess the power to bind or dilute such a liberated mind again? The Buddha Shakyamuni did not wait until attaining enlightenment beneath the Bodhi tree to realize freedom. For throughout countless previous lifetimes, he had already cultivated the practice of renunciation and regarded all worldly pleasures as insignificant and empty. Once, a young mother carried her child before the Buddha and honestly confessed that in this entire world, she loved her child more than anything else, even more than her own life. After hearing her words, the Buddha merely smiled gently before using spiritual power to create a great blazing fire directly before them, causing the woman to panic as she tightly embraced her child and desperately tried to shield the baby from danger. Yet as the flames grew hotter and closer to her body, in that moment of overwhelming terror and fear of death, the mother instinctively pushed the child forward in order to shield herself from the burning fire. Through this story, we can see that when facing danger threatening one's own life, most human beings instinctively seek to protect themselves first, even while their words often claim to love others more than themselves. For this reason, the willingness to sacrifice one's own life in order to save another is truly an exceedingly difficult act, achievable only by those who have transcended deep attachment to the ego and self. The radiant path of liberation walked by Buddhas and Bodhisattvas is not meant for those who endlessly cling to themselves, but for those courageous enough to release what is hardest to release and accomplish what is hardest to accomplish. There is another story about a wealthy elder who had a young son possessing great intelligence and an unusually sincere devotion toward the three jewels. The boy realized that his father had become deeply attached to false teachers and heterodox philosophers. So he sought a way to awaken him and prevent him from continuing down the wrong path through misguided teachings. Because of this, the boy asked his father to host a grand banquet, inviting the philosophers and respected elders to attend, hoping to create an opportunity to reveal the truth before a large gathering of people. The wealthy elder trusted those philosophers greatly, so he happily agreed and prepared a magnificent feast to receive the guests with extraordinary ceremony and celebration. While everyone sat waiting for the banquet to begin, the philosophers suddenly burst into loud laughter, causing the crowd to ask in surprise why they were laughing so strangely amidst so many people. One philosopher replied that in a distant place, high upon a mountain, there was a stream where tree branches from both sides intertwined together, and he had just witnessed a monkey slipping into the water, which he found amusing. Hearing this, many people became deeply impressed and believed the philosopher possessed miraculous spiritual powers capable of seeing events occurring far beyond ordinary human sight. Only the wealthy elder's young son understood clearly that these were lies, spoken merely to display mystical powers and deceive the hearts of naive people. So he quietly devised a way to expose the deception. When the meal was served, the boy intentionally placed delicious food at the bottom of the bowls and covered everything with plain white rice before respectfully serving them to the heterodox philosophers. Meanwhile, all the other guests received their meals in the normal manner, with food visible on top of the rice. So everyone happily enjoyed the banquet with ease and satisfaction. Only the philosophers sat motionless, without eating, because all they could see was plain white rice, unaware that many delicious dishes had been hidden underneath. The wealthy elder son politely asked why they were refusing to eat, and the philosophers replied that bland white rice alone was far too tasteless for them to swallow. At that moment, the boy smiled gently and replied that if they could clearly see a monkey falling into a stream hundreds of miles away, then why could they not see the delicious food hidden directly before their own eyes beneath the rice? Hearing those words, everyone at the banquet burst into laughter because they suddenly realized that the philosophers had merely been using lies and false mystical claims to deceive gullible people. The philosophers became deeply ashamed and angrily stormed away, and from that day onward, they no longer dared boast about fake spiritual powers before the public. Within this world, driven by greed for fame and profit, people constantly invent countless schemes to deceive one another, hoping only to obtain wealth, admiration, and recognition for themselves. Some people rely on power, while others rely on wealth. Yet there are also those who exploit the spiritual faith of others by creating an aura of mystery and falsely claiming enlightenment in order to mislead the world. Many individuals need only cloak themselves in mystery and proclaim possession by spirits or attainment of profound realization, and immediately numerous naive people bow their heads in belief and worship. They often use vague prophecies concerning future fortune and disaster to manipulate human greed and fear, thereby causing others to become dependent and offer endless gifts and money without hesitation. To those craving wealth, they promise riches and prosperity, while to those obsessed with status and recognition, they paint grand visions of power and prestige, causing listeners to become increasingly deluded and attached. Those who falsely pretend to be spiritual practitioners rarely say anything that might offend others, because they understand that speaking difficult truths would quickly cause people to stop respecting and supporting them. Time eventually reveals the truth behind such deception, yet before the world fully awakens, many impostors have already enjoyed abundant wealth, fame, and sensual pleasures gained from the superstitions of the masses. A sincere practitioner of the Buddha's teachings must always use wisdom to examine all things carefully and should never blindly believe teachings that contradict karma and the true path of liberation merely because of greed for miracles or blessings. Within this world, there are still many sincere and upright people who refuse to support falsehood and superstition, and instead wish to expose those who exploit the sacred and divine in order to deceive the trusting hearts of innocent beings. If one wishes to clearly distinguish between the true path and mere outward deception, one must learn from the wisdom of the wealthy elder son from long ago, by using fairness and clear discernment to observe the words and actions of others. By calmly and carefully reflecting upon things, it becomes obvious that those who constantly boast of supernatural powers or spiritual attainment often fail even in understanding ordinary matters of daily life. Yet many people are far too easily deceived, and whenever someone correctly predicts a few trivial matters or displays unusual behavior, they immediately rush to worship that person as a divine being without any thoughtful examination. Whenever such people happen to speak correctly, the superstitious praise them as sacred and miraculous, while if they speak falsely, excuses are quickly made by claiming that heavenly mysteries are simply too profound for ordinary minds to understand. Once superstition has deeply rooted itself within the heart, human beings become extremely vulnerable to manipulation and deception, because at that point, wisdom no longer shines clearly enough to distinguish truth from schemes aimed at greed and fear. There was once a lay devotee named Kala Viet who deeply revered Manjushri Bodhisattva and always longed for the opportunity to personally behold the Bodhisattva's sacred appearance within his lifetime. One day, he carefully purified himself through strict observance and organized a grand charity gathering, constructing a solemn and beautiful Dharma platform, while sincerely praying that Manjushri Bodhisattva would descend and appear there. News of the charitable event quickly spread far and wide, causing countless poor people and wandering beggars from many regions to gather together in hopes of receiving food and necessities to survive another day. Among the beggars, there was an elderly man with a frail body, filthy, ragged clothing, and a miserable appearance so pitiful that most people naturally felt disgust and aversion upon seeing him. Seeing that the Dharma platform remained empty, the old beggar slowly climbed up to sit and rest there. But the wealthy devotee immediately ordered others to escort him down, while explaining that the platform was reserved solely for welcoming Manjushri Bodhisattva. Afterward, he gave the old man a little money and instructed him to leave, believing that such a poor and miserable appearance was unsuitable for the sacred and dignified platform he had prepared. Strangely, for many consecutive days, the old beggar repeatedly returned and climbed back onto the Dharma platform. Yet every single time the wealthy devotee ordered people to remove him once again. Then, one night, after the great charitable ceremony had ended, the wealthy devotee dreamed of a divine being who told him that the beggar climbing onto the platform had in fact been Manjushri Bodhisattva, manifesting in disguise to test his heart. Hearing those words within the dream, the wealthy devotee awoke in shock and overwhelming regret, realizing with deep sorrow that he had repeatedly driven away a bodhisattva merely because of attachment to outward appearance. All practitioners of the Buddha's teachings long to encounter Buddhas and bodhisattvas, yet most imagine that such enlightened beings must appear surrounded by radiant light and majestic splendor before they are willing to believe. The wealthy devotee was the same, for he expected only a glorious and magnificent bodhisattva, while failing to realize that enlightened beings may manifest in any humble form amidst ordinary life. In this world, there are also many people who sincerely visit temples and worship the Buddha with great devotion. Yet when poor or sick individuals appear before them,
they respond with disdain and cold indifference rather than compassion. The Buddha once taught that when wealthy and powerful people lower themselves with compassion toward the poor and suffering, speaking gentle words of comfort and offering help with sincerity, the merit created becomes immeasurably vast. The blessings born from such genuine compassion are no different from making offerings to countless Buddhas, because Buddhas and Bodhisattvas love all beings equally, just as a loving mother cherishes her children. If human beings learn to treat everyone around them with equal respect and compassion, without dividing people into high and low, then no matter where they go, they may encounter the presence of bodhisattvas within everyday life. On the other hand, if pride and arrogance still fill the heart, causing one to look down upon others, then even if Buddhas or bodhisattvas appeared directly before them, they would still remain unable to recognize them. Those who remain attached to outward appearances easily miss the truth whenever it quietly manifests through simple and ordinary forms within daily life. There was another wealthy elder who spent his life in prosperity while deeply revering the three jewels, constantly practicing generosity and helping others, which caused many people in the region to respect and admire him greatly.
After he passed away, his descendants carried his body to a high hill, where they performed an elaborate cremation ceremony before carefully collecting the ashes and placing them within a sacred urn upon a beautifully decorated altar in their home. They displayed countless delicious foods and rare offerings before the memorial shrine, while weeping bitterly together, believing such actions demonstrated filial devotion and deep love for their departed father. Seeing this scene, the heavenly king understood that the wealthy elder's descendants had become excessively attached to emotion and were therefore engaging in meaningless acts, because the dead can no longer enjoy worldly offerings. Wishing to awaken them, the heavenly king transformed himself into a young cowherd boy and led a buffalo toward the place where the wealthy elder's family was conducting their grand memorial ceremony. At that moment, the buffalo suddenly collapsed and died beside the road. So the boy began stuffing grass into its mouth while crying loudly and trying to force it to eat, causing everyone nearby to stare in confusion. The boy even shouted angrily and struck the dead buffalo as though trying to force it to rise and eat grass again, making the wealthy elder's family believe the child was foolish and ignorant. They quickly told him that the buffalo was already dead and therefore could no longer eat, and no amount of forcing or crying could ever change such a reality. Hearing this, the boy immediately replied that at least the buffalo had only just died and still possessed an intact mouth, whereas they were displaying magnificent feasts before a jar of ashes, while expecting the dead to somehow enjoy the food. Those direct and honest words awaken the entire family, helping them realize that clinging excessively to ceremonial appearances while neglecting the cultivation of genuine merit for the deceased brought no true benefit at all. They became deeply astonished by the wisdom of the young boy and asked whose child he was and where he had come from to speak such profound words capable of awakening the human heart. At that moment, the boy revealed that he himself was the manifestation of the deceased wealthy elder, who, because of serving the 3 jewels and performing many virtuous deeds in his previous life, had now been reborn within a joyful heavenly realm. He had appeared only because he saw his descendants drowning endlessly in grief and attachment to family affection, while forgetting the most important thing of all, which was to cultivate virtue and create genuine merit for themselves and for the departed. After speaking those awakening words filled with profound wisdom, the heavenly king revealed his divine form once more and ascended back to the celestial realm, leaving the wealthy elder's family standing silently in deep emotion and contemplation. Since ancient times, the tradition of memorial offerings for departed parents and ancestors has existed to remind descendants of the immeasurable debt of birth and upbringing, while preserving the sacred bonds of family lineage and gratitude. Whenever the anniversary of a loved one's passing arrives, family members often gather together to prepare meals and offerings for their ancestors as a way of expressing remembrance, gratitude, and love toward those who have departed from this world. For sincere Buddhist practitioners, such occasions also become opportunities for the entire family to create merit together through chanting sutras, performing virtuous deeds, and dedicating the resulting merit toward the peaceful liberation of the deceased. Yet many families today, because of attachment to outward forms and empty customs, slaughter countless pigs, chickens, fish, and other living creatures during memorial ceremonies, while extravagantly preparing luxurious feasts at enormous expense. They place the offerings upon the altar only to remove them later so the living may eat and drink excessively together, and sometimes arguments even arise, causing sacred memorial days to become occasions for creating further negative karma. Such actions bring no real benefit to the deceased, because once the body has long returned to dust, how could the departed possibly continue enjoying material food and worldly pleasures? In earlier times, faithful devotees during memorial periods or after the passing of loved ones would instead focus upon making offerings to the Sangha, helping the poor, and releasing living beings in order to create merit that could be dedicated toward the deceased. They believed that through the wholesome power of such virtuous actions, the spirits of departed relatives might lessen their suffering, escape dark realms, and eventually be reborn within more peaceful and luminous conditions. The Buddha once taught that when the living sincerely perform good deeds for the sake of departed relatives, the merit created first brings immense benefit to the hearts and lives of those performing the virtuous acts themselves. On the other hand, if one kills living beings and creates painful karma in the name of worshipping the dead, then not only does it fail to help the departed spirit, but it also causes the karmic burden of both sides to become even heavier. Through these ancient stories and the realities of modern life, wise people should courageously transform harmful and misguided customs so that remembrance of ancestors may return to the compassionate and wholesome spirit of the true Dharma. There is another story about a thief who heard rumors that within a certain temple there existed a gigantic golden cooking pot used by the monks to prepare meals for the community. His greed suddenly grew fierce and overwhelming, causing him day and night to search for a way to steal the precious golden pot. Yet, because outsiders could not easily enter the temple at night, he devised a daring plan. The thief shaved his head and beard before pretending to sincerely wish to become a monk so he could live inside the temple and patiently wait for the perfect opportunity to secretly steal the golden pot and escape unnoticed. The abbot saw the newcomer appearing humble and sincere. So, with compassion, he accepted him into the monastery, gave him the 3 refuges and 5 precepts, and taught him about the law of karma and the consequences of wholesome and unwholesome actions. As the thief listened to descriptions of the terrifying karmic results produced by evil deeds, especially the suffering awaiting greedy thieves within hellish realms, profound fear gradually arose within his heart. From that initial fear, he slowly awakened and sincerely repented for his past wrongdoings, diligently studying and practicing the Dharma like someone genuinely wishing to turn away from evil and cultivate goodness. After a long period of earnest cultivation, through the power of sincerity and profound inner transformation, the former thief eventually attained spiritual realization far beyond anything he had originally imagined possible. Once enlightened, he felt deeply moved as he remembered that the original reason he had entered the Buddhist path was merely because of greed for the golden pot in the monastery kitchen long ago. Reflecting upon that extraordinary karmic connection, he approached the golden pot and bowed before it many times with profound gratitude, recognizing that it had become the very condition leading him toward liberation. Every person in this world possesses some degree of greed, yet greed so extreme that one would attempt to steal from the 3 jewels is truly a grave and frightening karmic offense for anyone walking the spiritual path. And yet, because he entered the monastery and listened to the wondrous teachings of the Buddha, the darkness of greed and attachment within his heart gradually transformed into the radiant light of true awakening. If someone who once harbored such corrupt intentions could still sincerely repent and eventually attain liberation, then anyone in this life possesses the possibility of transformation if they know how to turn back in time. What matters most is not how many mistakes one committed in the past, but whether one possesses enough courage to recognize wrongdoing sincerely, transform oneself honestly, and diligently continue cultivating the path. The karmic causes leading people toward spiritual practice differ greatly from one person to another. For some seek liberation, some flee worldly suffering, while others are driven by painful circumstances to seek refuge within the Buddha's path. Even the thief from this story originally entered monastic life merely to steal wealth through deception. Yet because of karmic conditions allowing him to hear the Dharma, he eventually awakened and reached the genuine path of enlightenment. Buddhist practitioners today possess far more favorable and peaceful conditions for learning the Dharma than the thief from long ago. And if they cultivate sincerely with wholehearted devotion, there is no reason they cannot advance far upon the path of liberation. On another occasion, King Pasenadi sat within his palace and overheard 2 gate officials outside debating the question of what human beings truly rely upon amidst this impermanent world. One official declared that his entire existence depended completely upon the king, because without the royal court he would never have enjoyed stability, wealth, or social position within his life. The other official disagreed
and insisted that no one can ever rely entirely upon another person, because all happiness and suffering ultimately arise from one's own karma created in the past. Hearing this debate, King Pasenadi secretly wished to test whose words were correct, so he immediately devised a subtle plan to examine the matter for himself. He instructed a trusted servant to enter the inner palace and quietly tell the queen that shortly afterward someone would deliver wine, and she should reward that person generously with jewels and precious treasures. Then the king intentionally left behind half a jar of wine and specifically ordered the official who claimed his life depended upon royal favor to carry the wine into the queen's chambers. That official became delighted and confidently believed he would soon receive magnificent rewards, so he happily carried the wine away with great pride and hopeful anticipation. Unexpectedly, the moment he stepped beyond the palace gates, he suddenly became dizzy and weak as blood began pouring heavily from his nose, leaving him unable to continue carrying the wine into the inner palace.
In desperation, he was forced to ask another person to deliver the wine in his place, completely unaware that this tiny change would become the profound answer to the entire debate concerning karma and destiny. The official later bowed respectfully before the king and explained that immediately after leaving the palace gate, his nose had begun bleeding uncontrollably, and his body had become so weak and dizzy that he had no choice but to ask another man to carry the wine instead. After hearing this account, King Pasenadi sighed deeply and realized that the Buddha's teachings concerning karma and cause and effect were indeed perfectly true without even the slightest error. He understood that all blessings and suffering experienced by human beings arise from the karma each person has created, and that no ruler, power, or personal favor can truly alter those results on another's behalf. Human beings often observe differences in appearance, status, intelligence, and circumstance throughout life, and assume these inequalities are arranged by heaven or determined by some external destiny. Yet, according to the Buddha's teaching, all such differences originate from the 10 karmic actions of body, speech, and mind that each person has accumulated throughout countless lifetimes until the present moment. The body creates 3 forms of karma through killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct, causing beings to harm one another while generating endless suffering and resentment throughout samsara. Speech creates 4 forms of karma through lying, divisive speech, harsh words, and meaningless chatter, disturbing the hearts of others and creating countless afflictions and sorrows within human life. The mind also creates 3 great karmas through greed, hatred, and wrong views, causing the human soul to remain drowned in delusion, selfishness, and attachment to the ego without ever finding true peace. Together, these 10 actions become the 10 unwholesome karmas that lead beings into suffering, while transforming them into wholesome deeds opens a radiant and peaceful path toward a brighter future. Every thought that arises, every word that is spoken, and every action that is performed silently forms karmic force, and it is precisely this invisible power that guides beings through samsara to receive corresponding consequences. Because of the wholesome or unwholesome karma people have created, some are born today into wealth and honor, while others endure poverty, sickness, and endless hardship throughout life, whether intelligent or foolish, healthy or disabled. All conditions arise through the operation of karma and cause and effect that each being has personally planted throughout countless previous lives. The Buddha never taught that Buddhas or gods arbitrarily bestow blessings or disasters upon humanity, because all fortune and misfortune arise from the karmic causes each individual personally creates. If one consistently cultivates wholesome deeds, then naturally kind people will appear to offer support. Many hearts will grow to love and respect them, and life will gradually become more peaceful and harmonious over time. On the other hand, those who habitually sow cruelty and wrongdoing will find that even if they rely upon power or flatter the wealthy, they still cannot escape misfortune and the contempt of the world. People who do not understand karma often resent life and use every dishonest scheme to pursue benefit, never realizing that such actions merely deepen and multiply their negative karma even further. This is no different from a thirsty person drinking salt water, hoping to quench thirst, only to end up suffering even more intensely in both body and mind. Through the story of King Pasenadi, we can clearly see that every human being is the true architect of their own future, through the wholesome or unwholesome karma created in each present moment. If one deeply understands this truth, then every practitioner of the Buddha's teachings must remain mindful and careful in every thought, word, and action in order to gradually build a peaceful and luminous future. There is another story that took place in the kingdom of Shravasti, when one day a rain as red as blood suddenly poured down from the heavens across the land, causing the people and royal court to become overwhelmed with terror. The king feared it was an evil omen, so he immediately summoned a sorcerer skilled in mystical arts to investigate the cause of such a strange and unprecedented phenomenon. After careful examination, the sorcerer declared that the blood rain was an ominous sign, foretelling that a giant serpent spirit disguised in human form had appeared within the human world and would bring enormous calamity. The king then asked how such a being could possibly be identified among the countless citizens, and the sorcerer instructed that every newborn child in the kingdom should be tested through a special method. He explained that each infant should be brought near a vessel of water, because if the child were truly the serpent spirit in disguise, the poisonous energy surrounding it would cause the water to boil and steam intensely. After following these instructions, they discovered a strange infant radiating terrifying, poisonous energy, and they named the child the Serpent Man, before confining him deep within a remote forest to prevent disaster from befalling the people. The king also ordered that criminals condemned to death should thereafter be brought before the Serpent Man, so they could perish from his deadly poison instead of being publicly executed. In this way, throughout his lifetime, the Serpent Man killed countless human beings,
causing the karma of slaughter to accumulate within him as vast and heavy as the ocean itself. As old age and grave illness approached near the end of his life, the Buddha used his wisdom vision to perceive that if the serpent man died carrying such immense evil karma, he would fall into hell realms for an unimaginably long period of suffering.
Because of his boundless compassion for all beings, even those burdened with terrible wrongdoing, the Buddha sent Venerable Sariputta to guide the serpent man before death, in hopes of saving the final remnants of goodness still hidden within him. When the serpent man saw a monk boldly entering his cave, he immediately became enraged because he believed no one would dare approach while he remained alive and filled with deadly poison. He instantly opened his mouth and released a powerful stream of poisonous energy intended to kill Venerable Sariputta. Yet, because of the saintly monk's immense merit and purified wisdom, the poison could not harm him in the slightest. Unwilling to surrender, the serpent man repeatedly unleashed more poison again and again. Yet the more he attacked, the more radiant and peaceful Venerable Sariputta's appearance became, filling him with astonishment. At that moment, the serpent man finally realized that the being before him must certainly possess extraordinary spiritual virtue, and for the first time in his life, a sense of reverence and wholesome thought began arising within his heart. He then gazed respectfully upon Venerable Sariputta from head to toe, again and again, with deep admiration, and with each moment his wholesome mind grew stronger and more sincere than before. Once Venerable Sariputta perceived that the serpent man had genuinely awakened sincere goodness within himself, he returned to the Buddha and respectfully reported that the guidance had succeeded perfectly, just as the Blessed One had foreseen. Exactly 7 days later, the serpent man breathed his final breath, and because of the deep, wholesome mind awakened during his encounter with the saintly monk, he was reborn within a heavenly realm of wondrous joy and peace. When King Magadha heard this story, he became greatly astonished and respectfully asked the Buddha how someone responsible for killing so many beings could possibly attain rebirth within the heavenly realms. The Buddha compassionately explained that because the serpent man repeatedly generated sincere reverence and purity of heart toward Venerable Sariputta during the final moments of his life, he created immensely powerful, wholesome karma. Through the merit of that wholesome mind, after exhausting the blessings of the heavenly realm, the serpent man would continue ascending into even higher heavens and eventually attain the realization of a Pratyeka Buddha in the distant future. The king then asked what would happen to the enormous karma created from the countless murders committed by the serpent man, because such evil deeds seemed far too terrible to escape consequences. The Buddha explained that in the final lifetime before attaining Pratyeka Buddhahood, the being's body would shine with brilliant golden radiance like a precious treasure, causing those who saw him to become consumed by greed and delusion. One day, while the future Pratyeka Buddha sat meditating beneath a tree, a large group of soldiers passed nearby and mistook his radiant golden body for a statue made of pure gold. So they rushed toward him and began cutting away pieces to seize as treasure. Yet the moment the soldiers lifted the pieces of flesh they had cut away, those fragments instantly transformed into foul-smelling blood and pus, causing everyone to recoil in terror before dropping them and fleeing in panic. That event became the final remaining karmic consequence from the heavy karma of killing created during the Serpent Man's former lives, and through that suffering, the burden of karma was at last largely exhausted. After completing that final karmic retribution, the Pratyeka Buddha peacefully entered nirvana in complete purity and liberation, forever freed from the endless bondage of birth and death throughout countless lifetimes. Through this story, the Buddha taught that even if a being's karma is as immense as mountains and oceans, if they encounter a true spiritual teacher and sincerely turn toward goodness, transformation and liberation still remain possible. The Serpent Man spent his entire life consumed by violence and hatred, creating terrible, evil karma. Yet, through a single sincere moment of wholesome reverence toward a saintly being, he transformed the destiny of his future completely. From this, we can see the wondrous transformative power of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, whose influence is so immense that it can guide beings standing at the edge of hell back toward the path of peace and liberation. If human beings refuse to return and seek refuge in the Three Jewels, refusing to abandon evil and cultivate goodness, then karma will continue dragging them endlessly through suffering without any hope of escape. To obtain a human birth within the vast ocean of samsara is already extraordinarily rare, yet encountering the true Dharma is infinitely more difficult still, and therefore anyone fortunate enough to meet the path should treasure it deeply. Many people encounter the Buddha's teachings and yet still refuse to awaken, allowing their days to drift away within desire and delusion, while never sincerely turning inward to transform and cultivate themselves. Once the human body is lost, no one truly knows where consciousness will continue drifting amidst the endless current of karma, rebirth, and karmic consequences accumulated throughout countless lifetimes. There is another story that took place in the city of Shravasti concerning a wealthy and intelligent elder who, because his mind was clouded by wrong views, refused to believe in karma and insisted that doing good deeds brought no real benefit at all. Using his divine vision, Venerable Sariputta perceived that although the wealthy elder was presently enjoying great blessings, if he continued living with such wrong views, he would certainly fall into painful, lower realms in the future. Out of compassion and a sincere wish to rescue the man from delusion, Venerable Sariputta personally came to the elder's mansion precisely while he sat dining luxuriously with his family in an atmosphere of great wealth and refinement. The moment the elder saw a monk carrying an alms bowl enter seeking food, he became furious and declared that monks were nothing more than beggars, immediately ordering his guards to insult and violently drive the monk away. Even after being humiliated in such a manner, Venerable Sariputta remained silently, with boundless compassion and not the slightest trace of anger, patiently waiting for the elder to finish his meal before quietly observing further. After the meal ended, the elder contemptuously spat a mouthful of saliva into the monk's bowl and mocked him by saying that such an act should already count as charity toward a poor wandering ascetic. Without anger or resentment, Venerable Sariputta simply joined his palms together and offered a blessing, wishing that the wealthy elder might enjoy blessings throughout future lives and one day encounter the liberating light of truth. Afterward, the venerable monk carried the dirty water within the bowl away, mixed it carefully with earth, and spread it upon the Buddha's walking path, while silently wishing that even this tiny karmic connection might someday become a wholesome cause for the elder. He also respectfully requested that the Blessed One compassionately walk upon that very ground, so the wealthy elder, despite unknowingly creating the connection, might still receive immeasurable merit in the future. Meanwhile, the wealthy elder became curious and secretly ordered a servant to follow the monk and discover what he would do after leaving the mansion amidst the quiet evening. When the servant returned and recounted the entire story of Venerable Sariputta's compassion, patience, and selflessness, together with the Buddha's kindness, the wealthy elder suddenly felt overwhelmed by shame and deep remorse. He began reflecting that the Buddha himself had once been a king possessing limitless wealth and power, and if he still desired fame and worldly gain, there would have been no reason to abandon everything in order to wander the world carrying an alms bowl. Through such deep reflection, the elder's wrong views gradually dissolved and were replaced by profound admiration and emotion before the selfless compassion and virtue of the Buddhas and noble saints. Soon afterward, the wealthy elder led his entire family before the Buddha to sincerely repent for his wrongdoing and humbly request teachings capable of transforming his life. The Buddha compassionately taught the Dharma to awaken wisdom within him, causing the wealthy elder to realize the truth, attain the stage of non-retrogression, and develop unwavering faith in the three jewels thereafter. Through this seemingly small incident, we can clearly see that the lives of the Buddha and the noble saints forever shine as radiant examples of selflessness and sacrifice for the welfare of all beings. No matter how misunderstood, insulted, or despised they may be, such enlightened beings never respond with anger, but seek only skillful ways to guide deluded people back toward the true path. How much more compassionate, then, are the Buddhas and noble monks toward those who sincerely seek to learn and practice the path of liberation, for they wholeheartedly dedicate themselves to guiding such people toward awakening. If one reflects carefully enough, it becomes obvious that the Buddha never needed worldly fame or wealth, because while still a king, he had already possessed every form of power and luxury human beings endlessly desire.
A person who willingly abandoned a royal throne and supreme worldly pleasures in order to wander with an alms bowl throughout the world clearly cannot be motivated by greed for fame and profit, as ordinary people imagine. The Buddha practiced almsgathering solely because of boundless compassion and a wish to create opportunities for beings to form wholesome karmic connections with the three jewels. Although today we can no longer meet the Buddha in physical form as people did long ago, his liberating teachings still remain perfectly preserved for those fortunate enough to encounter them. Before entering nirvana, the Buddha instructed his disciples to rely upon the scriptures and the Dharma in their cultivation, because beyond that path, there was nothing further he needed to teach. If human beings today still doubt or turn away from the compassionate and wisdom-filled teachings of the Buddha, then such a loss is truly tragic for their own lives. There was once another occasion when three laymen gathered in a secluded place to drink wine and indulge themselves in pleasure, completely unaware that intoxication was gradually covering over their wisdom and goodness.
While all three men were deeply immersed in drunkenness, the Buddha and his disciples happened to pass nearby, causing the men to become extremely frightened, because they knew they were violating moral precepts and behaving contrary to the true Dharma. One man became so terrified that he immediately ran and hid within the bushes, as though avoiding the Buddha's gaze could somehow erase his wrongdoing into darkness. The second man had no time to flee, and therefore sat curled up silently with a face full of shame, inwardly trembling with both regret and fear, because he understood he had acted carelessly through intoxication. Only the third man, though equally drunk, forced himself to stand while pretending to be sober, dancing wildly and loudly claiming that he was offering fine wine to the Buddha in order to conceal his wrongdoing. When the Buddha observed this scene, he merely smiled gently before turning toward the monks, wishing to use this small event as a profound lesson about delusion and awakening within the human mind. The Buddha softly asked the monks whether they had noticed the three drunken men, explaining that each person was silently choosing the future path of their own destiny. He taught that the first man, who felt shame and fled because of embarrassment over his wrongdoing, would, during the time of Maitreya Buddha, encounter the Dharma and eventually attain liberation. The second man, though unable to flee, still bowed his head in shame because he recognized his actions were wrong, and therefore in future lives he too would encounter many Buddhas and receive guidance toward awakening. Only the third man, because he attempted to conceal his wrongdoing while dancing and lying that he was offering wine to the Buddha, remained deeply trapped within delusion and attachment, and no one could know how long it would take before he finally awakened. Wine and worldly desires possess an extremely powerful ability to intoxicate the human mind, causing people to continue wrongdoing even while fully aware that their actions are harmful and mistaken. Those three laymen already understood clearly that drinking wine violated the precepts, yet because they could not overcome craving, they sought out a hidden place to indulge themselves while believing no one would ever know. When they unexpectedly encountered the Buddha passing nearby, the first man immediately sought to escape because of shame, and this revealed that wholesome roots and the potential for transformation still remained alive within his heart. Those who feel shame before their own mistakes usually find it easier to correct themselves and awaken more quickly, because the sense of moral shame is the very first doorway leading human beings back toward virtue and truth. The second man lacked the courage to flee, yet at least he still recognized his actions as wrong and silently endured his shame. And such a person will eventually repent and transform, even if somewhat more slowly.
Most dangerous of all are people like the third man, who commit wrongdoing yet refuse to admit fault, choosing instead to deceive both themselves and others in order to conceal their actions, because such people rarely transform sincerely. A society filled with individuals accustomed to dishonesty and incapable of admitting mistakes will inevitably become increasingly chaotic, and it becomes even more dangerous when such people hold positions of great power.
There was once a monk traveling along the road who suddenly needed urgently to urinate, but could not find a private place in time, forcing him to stand quietly beside the road in a moment of great urgency. A passerby who witnessed this immediately mocked the monk, saying that such behavior lacked dignity and refinement, and that a person wearing sacred robes should never behave in so disgraceful a manner. Nearby, there was a naked ascetic from another sect who overheard those words of criticism, and within his heart a deep reflection suddenly arose concerning the virtue and discipline of the Buddha and his disciples. The man thought to himself that if even a tiny accidental mistake by a monk could provoke such criticism from the world, then surely the Buddha and the Sangha must live lives of extraordinary discipline, dignity, and moral purity. He reflected further that within his own sect, although its followers wandered everywhere unclothed, no one even bothered to criticize them anymore, because the world no longer expected anything noble or worthy from them. Through such contemplation, the ascetic developed sincere faith and sought out the Buddha to request refuge and ordination. And after hearing the wondrous Dharma, he soon attained the first stage upon the path toward liberation. Life in this world is much like passing beside a pile of foul-smelling garbage, for everyone merely wishes to avoid it quickly, and no one feels inclined to stand still and criticize it further. Yet when a beautiful mirror or precious jewel bears even the slightest blemish, people immediately notice it and feel disappointment because they expect perfection from something already considered precious. The same is true for spiritual practitioners, because society naturally expects those who carry the image of the Dharma to live with purity and discipline, and therefore even a small mistake can easily become the object of criticism. Sometimes there are indeed people driven by jealousy who search for faults merely to tarnish the goodness of others, yet most criticism actually arises from the hope that practitioners may become even more virtuous and complete. People in this world long to see among spiritual practitioners a life of purity, boundless compassion, and dignified conduct that may serve as a shining example for society to follow. For this reason, if a practitioner loses moral discipline even slightly, it easily causes others to lose faith and give rise to criticism, and such reactions are natural within human life. Once, a professor held up a sheet of white paper containing only a tiny black dot and asked his students what they noticed upon the page before them. Every student immediately answered that they saw a black dot, while not a single person mentioned the vast white space covering almost the entire page before their eyes. The professor smiled gently and explained that human beings often possess the habit of focusing upon one tiny flaw while forgetting the countless beautiful and wholesome things surrounding it. Through this lesson, he wished to remind his students to preserve the purity of their character carefully, because the world often remembers our mistakes far longer than the good deeds we have done. If spiritual practitioners fail to uphold discipline sincerely, then ridicule from society becomes difficult to avoid, because the higher one stands morally, the more careful one must become even in the smallest actions. What is truly admirable within this story is that the ascetic did not respond to criticism with jealousy or hostility toward Buddhism, but instead used another person's mistake as a mirror for examining himself. Because he reflected wisely and objectively upon right and wrong, he abandoned false views and returned to the true Dharma, eventually attaining liberation not long afterward. One day, the Buddha and his disciples were passing beside a vast field where a farmer labored beneath the burning midday sun, diligently ploughing the earth. When the farmer saw the Buddha's majestic appearance and the peaceful radiance flowing from him, a deep reverence, unlike anything he had ever felt before, suddenly arose within his heart. He felt overwhelming joy and wished to run forward immediately to bow before the Buddha and take refuge in the three jewels. Because within the Blessed One, he sensed a peace and compassion rarely found in ordinary life. Yet, just as he prepared to step away, he remembered the unfinished work still waiting in his fields, and thought to himself that he could always return later, after completing everything, to seek refuge properly. The farmer believed he should first finish his farming duties, complete the planting and harvest, and only afterward dedicate time to learning the Dharma and paying homage to the Buddha. Using his wisdom vision, the Buddha clearly perceived the farmer's habit of postponement and merely smiled compassionately, causing Venerable Ananda beside him to feel curious and respectfully ask for the reason. The Buddha then told his disciples to look carefully at the farmer ploughing the field, explaining that throughout countless lives, the man had repeatedly missed opportunities to enter the path of liberation because of his endless habit of delay. The Blessed One taught that across 91 lifetimes, the farmer had repeatedly encountered Buddhas appearing in the world, and each time sincere reverence and the wish to seek refuge arose within him. Yet whenever he felt inspired to bow before a Buddha, he would immediately think about unfinished farm work and reassure himself that later, when life became less busy, there would still be time to cultivate the path. Thus, lifetime after lifetime, the farmer remained endlessly occupied with farming and worldly survival, never once truly dedicating himself wholeheartedly to taking refuge in the three jewels. Even now, standing before the living Buddha, the same wish to seek refuge arose again within his heart. Yet, as always, the moment he remembered unfinished work, his spiritual aspiration began fading away. When the Buddha revealed this long history of procrastination spanning countless lifetimes, the farmer became deeply frightened and suddenly awakened to the danger hidden within such a seemingly harmless habit. He immediately abandoned his farming tools and ran before the Buddha with utmost sincerity, bowing down and requesting refuge in the three jewels at once, without daring to delay any longer. Whether worldly people
or spiritual practitioners, laziness and procrastination remain enormous obstacles, preventing progress and success in every aspect of life. To achieve wholesome results in anything, whether great or small, human beings must diligently act the very moment a wholesome intention arises, instead of endlessly postponing it for another time. A single simple thought, such as, "I will do it later," or "I will wait until this work is finished," was enough to cause that farmer to wander through countless lifetimes without ever truly stepping through the gate of the Dharma. People often say they will practice when they become less busy, or perform good deeds once life stabilizes. Yet worldly affairs continue endlessly and never truly come to completion. If one constantly waits for a perfect future moment, then perhaps even at the end of life, one will still have never truly begun living with meaning and awakening. Because impermanence never gives warning, the most important thing is to perform the wholesome actions available in the present moment, rather than relying upon distant plans whose tomorrow may never arrive. There was once a simple farmer who came to the marketplace and noticed a large sign hanging before an elegant restaurant, declaring that tomorrow's meals would be free of charge, filling him with delight. He thought happily to himself that this was wonderful, and therefore tomorrow he would certainly return and enjoy a grand feast without spending a single coin. The next day, he dressed carefully and joyfully entered the restaurant, ordering countless delicious dishes and eating with immense satisfaction and pride. After finishing his meal, he stood up to leave, but the owner approached, asking for payment, causing the farmer to become furious, because he believed the sign clearly promised free meals. The restaurant owner merely smiled gently and pointed toward the sign, calmly explaining that it stated tomorrow's meals would be free, whereas today's meal still required full payment like every other customer. Hearing this, the poor farmer could only remove his old hat as collateral before sadly walking away, muttering to himself that he no longer knew where such a tomorrow could ever truly be found. That simple parable perfectly reflects human life, because tomorrow never truly arrives and often becomes merely an excuse for postponing what should be done today. If spiritual practice and wholesome deeds are endlessly pushed toward another future day, then by the time life finally ends, one may still stand empty-handed without ever planting even the smallest seed of blessing for oneself. Therefore, if a wholesome deed can be done today, one should courageously carry it out at once, because tomorrow is merely a fragile shadow that death may take away at any moment. Once there was a monk walking across a lonely field when he suddenly heard a loud voice calling from the tall grass, causing him to stop in surprise and look carefully around. A serpent slowly emerged from the bushes and respectfully bowed its head, pleading with the monk not to be afraid, because it carried a deep karmic connection and longed to hear the Dharma in hopes of escaping its miserable existence as a snake. The serpent then asked whether the monk knew of the compassionate king Aki-Da, who had once been famous for building temples, giving generously, and making offerings to the Sangha.
leaving the monk even more astonished. When asked to reveal its identity, the serpent sorrowfully explained that it itself had once been King Akida, a ruler who performed many virtuous deeds, but had nevertheless fallen into rebirth as a serpent because of a single moment of anger at the time of death. The monk became deeply surprised, for he knew the king had created tremendous merit throughout his life, and should by all accounts have been reborn in heavenly realms, rather than falling into such a low and painful existence. The serpent then recounted that during the king's final moments, a servant accidentally dropped a fan onto his face, causing intense anger suddenly to erupt within his mind. Because of that single fierce thought of rage at the moment of death, the king's consciousness became entirely consumed by hatred, and thus he followed the force of negative karma into rebirth as a suffering serpent. Hearing this story, the monk compassionately taught the Dharma and recited sacred teachings to the serpent in order to awaken wholesome thoughts once more within that dark and painful realm. The serpent felt immense joy and lowered its head to the earth while listening attentively to every word of the wondrous Dharma, with a sincere longing to escape its karmic suffering. It even vowed to fast for many days in order to maintain purity of mind, and not long afterward it passed away and was reborn in heavenly realms because of the wholesome thoughts awakened at the end of its life. Soon afterward, that heavenly being descended from the celestial realms, scattering heavenly flowers as offerings before the Buddha, declaring from the sky that it had once been King Akida and had now attained heavenly rebirth through hearing the Dharma. Through this story, we can clearly see that those caring for the dying must remain extremely mindful in both words and actions, so they may help the dying person maintain peace and purity of mind. For practitioners following the Pure Land path, the final moments of life become even more important, because if one can maintain single-minded mindfulness of the Buddha, then rebirth into peaceful realms becomes possible. On the other hand, if the mind becomes chaotic, angry, or deeply attached during the final moments, karmic forces can easily drag consciousness toward dark and painful realms against one's wishes. Although King Akida had accumulated immense merit throughout his lifetime and deserved heavenly rebirth, because he failed to preserve a peaceful mind during his final moment, he suffered rebirth as a miserable serpent. Those studying the Buddha's teachings should therefore pay special attention to protecting and supporting the thoughts of the dying, because a single final thought of purity or hatred can determine the realm into which one is reborn. According to the sutras, even after breathing stops and the heart ceases beating, the consciousness of the deceased may still feel bodily pain, as though countless needles were piercing every part of the body simultaneously. At such a moment, if someone carelessly shakes or touches the newly deceased body roughly, the deceased may experience intense suffering and easily generate anger, thereby falling into painful and dark realms through karmic force. This situation resembles the pain felt when one's legs become numb after sitting too long, where even a slight movement
causes sharp discomfort, much less when consciousness still lingers near the body, stiffening through impermanence. For this reason, when a family member approaches death, relatives should avoid loud crying and desperate lamentation, because such behavior causes attachment and makes it harder for the dying person to let go peacefully. What should instead be done is to maintain a quiet and pure atmosphere while family members take turns chanting the Buddha's name and praying gently so the dying person may preserve mindfulness during those final, crucial moments. If the dying person hears the sound of Buddha recitation and the mind becomes calm and pure, then rebirth into peaceful realms or heavenly worlds filled with blessings becomes possible. One should understand that the final thought at the moment of death possesses extraordinary power, capable of transforming a person from evil realms toward wholesome realms, or causing a fall from wholesome realms into suffering within a single instant. Therefore, spiritual practitioners must be extremely careful and should never move the body of someone newly deceased carelessly, but instead wait until the entire body has completely grown cold before gently arranging it. Even if the limbs of the deceased appear twisted or stiff immediately after death, one should never forcibly straighten them, because doing so may cause great pain and awaken resentment within the departing consciousness. Only after the body has completely cooled should warm cloths be gently applied to stiff areas before slowly arranging the posture properly with the utmost compassion and respect. During funeral ceremonies, family members should also avoid loud chaos and the killing of living beings for offerings, but instead maintain purity of mind while chanting and praying for the peaceful liberation of the departed. The scriptures further teach that those reborn into blessed realms often display auspicious signs such as clarity of mind, awareness of the time of death, and the preservation of lucid mindfulness until the final breath. Some people even bathe and change into clean clothing before death, then sit upright with palms joined while peacefully reciting the Buddha's name, as though joyfully preparing to return to their true spiritual homeland. In many cases, mysterious fragrances or wondrous lights also appear around the body, causing witnesses to feel deep reverence and spiritual inspiration. Such stories are not meant merely to glorify the supernatural, but rather to encourage practitioners always to preserve pure mindfulness and prepare wisely for the final moment of life. Once, while the Buddha resided in Shravasti within Anathapindika's grove, the monks respectfully asked him about the extraordinary memory possessed by Venerable Ananda. They explained that whenever Venerable Ananda heard the Buddha teach the Dharma, he remembered every word perfectly without forgetting anything, and they wished to know what wholesome causes had created such remarkable powers of retention. The Buddha replied that Ananda's extraordinary memory did not arise by chance, but was the result of wholesome karma accumulated through helping others study and practice the Dharma across countless previous lives. The Blessed One then recounted that long ago there had once been a strict monk who carefully instructed a young novice and assigned rigorous daily recitation and study practices for his disciple. Whenever the young novice memorized the scriptures properly, the teacher rejoiced greatly and praised him warmly. Yet whenever the novice became careless or forgetful, the teacher sternly corrected him to encourage greater diligence upon the spiritual path.
Although the novice tried his very best, daily alms gathering proved extremely difficult, and whenever he travelled far enough to receive sufficient food, little time remained for study and recitation as instructed by his teacher. Many times the novice walked with his alms bowl while quietly weeping, because he feared failing his assigned lessons, and within his heart he longed desperately for enough food and enough time to devote himself fully to learning the Dharma. One day, a wealthy elder filled with compassion noticed the novice walking and crying at the same time. So he stopped and kindly asked what sorrow burdened such a young practitioner. After hearing the novice explain the difficulty of balancing alms gathering with scripture study, the wealthy elder felt deeply moved and immediately generated sincere compassion to help him. The elder then told the novice that from that day onward, he no longer needed to wander far seeking alms, but could instead come directly to his home each day, where food would always be prepared so he could peacefully devote himself to study and cultivation. Because the wealthy elder supported him in this way, the novice gradually gained abundant time for focused study, and soon mastered the teachings so thoroughly that both teacher and disciple rejoiced greatly together. The Buddha then concluded by explaining that the strict monk from long ago had been one of his own previous lives, that the young novice had later become the Buddha in another lifetime, and that the compassionate, wealthy elder had eventually become Venerable Ananda in the present age, because in previous lives he had wholeheartedly supported others in their spiritual cultivation. Ananda, in this life, received the immense blessing of extraordinary memory, hearing the Dharma only once, yet retaining every word perfectly without forgetting a single teaching. Among all the disciples of the Buddha, Venerable Ananda became renowned as the foremost in learning and memory, for every teaching he heard remained imprinted within his mind as clearly as the autumn moon reflected upon still water. Through this story, we can clearly see that sincerely helping others study and practice the Buddha's teachings brings immeasurable merit and blessings to oneself, both in the present life and throughout future existences. On the contrary, anyone who intentionally or carelessly obstructs another person's spiritual cultivation will create heavy karmic obstacles for themselves, causing difficulty in encountering the true Dharma and awakening wisdom in lifetime after lifetime. Those who deeply understand karma, even if unable to offer great assistance to practitioners, should, at the very least, avoid creating obstacles or planting additional suffering that might cause others to lose their wholesome connection with the three jewels. Long ago, there was a Brahmin king named Dadya who devoted himself completely to serving non-Buddhist teachings and possessed very little opportunity to encounter the wondrous Dharma of the Buddha. One day, the king suddenly developed a wholesome wish to hold a grand charitable gathering for the poor, and so he ordered countless quantities of gold, silver, jewels, and treasures from the royal treasury to be piled high like mountains within the public square. The king proclaimed that anyone who came seeking aid could freely take a handful of treasure according to their wishes without being questioned or restrained in any way. The act of giving continued for many days. Yet, strangely, the enormous piles of treasure seemed hardly diminished at all. despite the countless people arriving to receive gifts. Using his wisdom vision, the Buddha perceived that this king possessed deep, wholesome roots and had reached the proper time to be guided toward understanding the liberating truth beyond worldly desire. Therefore, the Blessed One transformed himself into the appearance of a noble ascetic with a dignified presence, calm demeanor, and eyes shining brilliantly with wisdom before approaching the king. Upon seeing the ascetic, the king warmly greeted him and said that a traveler from afar surely carried some wish within his heart, encouraging him to speak openly without hesitation. The ascetic replied that he wished to receive a little treasure in order to establish a household and begin a stable life. So the king joyfully invited him to take as much as he desired. The ascetic stepped forward and gathered an enormous handful of jewels before walking calmly away for several steps, only to suddenly return and pour everything back into its original place, leaving the king deeply puzzled. The king then asked why he had returned the treasure after already taking it, and the ascetic calmly replied that such wealth would only suffice for building a small house, but not enough to marry and establish a family. Hearing this, the king laughed heartily and encouraged him to take several more handfuls so he would possess enough wealth for a comfortable future without worry. The ascetic obeyed, taking even greater quantities of treasure and walking away again. Yet before long, he once more returned everything exactly as before, astonishing everyone present. Now even more curious, the king asked why the ascetic still refused to keep the treasure. And the ascetic gently explained that such wealth might suffice for a house and marriage, but remained far too little for purchasing fields, livestock, and servants. The king, eager to help further, encouraged him once again to take more, so he would never need to endure hardship or poverty amidst the uncertainties of worldly life. The ascetic again followed the king's suggestion and gathered an even greater amount of treasure. Yet, after only a few steps, he returned once more and placed everything back exactly where it had been. This time, the king truly could not understand, and loudly asked whether even such immense wealth still seemed insufficient for the luxurious and prosperous life the ascetic desired. The ascetic answered that he had begun thinking about future children who would need support and wealth for their upbringing, and about future sickness or misfortune requiring savings and protection. And therefore even that great treasure still did not feel truly sufficient. The king burst into laughter and finally declared that the ascetic should simply take the entire treasury according to his wishes, for surely then all worries and anxieties would finally disappear. This time, the ascetic stepped forward as though intending to accept the offer. It suddenly stopped, bowed respectfully in gratitude, and chose to depart empty-handed, leaving the king and ministers utterly bewildered. The king quickly called him back and asked what thoughts had finally led him to refuse all those precious treasures. The ascetic answered softly that at first he truly wished to receive wealth and establish a secure life. Yet, the more he reflected, the more he realized that human greed possesses no bottom and never truly knows satisfaction. People with little always desire more, and after obtaining a house, they crave fields and possessions, and after establishing a family, they continue worrying about descendants and future generations, endlessly chasing desires without ever discovering genuine peace. He further explained that material wealth may indeed be piled as high as mountains, yet human life itself remains fragile and impermanent, with no one knowing whether tomorrow will bring life or death. And therefore, excessive attachment to possessions merely multiplies anxiety and sorrow. Far better, he said, to abandon greed, live simply and honestly, and seek liberation beyond the endless cycle of competition for wealth and status. For only then can the soul discover true freedom and peace. Hearing these wisdom-filled words, the king suddenly awakened like a man emerging from a long dream of delusion, amidst a world overflowing with temptation and desire. He respectfully bowed before the ascetic and vowed that from that day onward he would follow such teachings by learning contentment and seeking truths nobler than ordinary material treasures. At that very moment, the ascetic revealed his true form as the Buddha, radiating magnificent light and rising into the sky, causing the king and all his ministers to feel overwhelming awe and reverence. The Buddha then taught that even if all the treasures of the world were stacked as high as the heavens, they would still not equal the value of awakening to truth and escaping the chains of worldly craving. The king gazed upon the Buddha's serene and radiant appearance while listening to the wondrous Dharma, and with immense joy, he and all his ministers took refuge and accepted the practice of the 5 precepts. After that gathering, the king attained the first stage upon the noble path, and from then onward began living a far simpler, purer, and more contented life than before. Human beings throughout history have always remained endlessly anxious about the future without ever feeling satisfied. For no sooner do they obtain a little fame or gain than they immediately crave even more. Some people live surrounded by wealth and luxury throughout their entire lives, yet greed within them never ceases, and after obtaining one treasure, they immediately long for another, forever comparing themselves to others without ever finding peace of mind. Human life is in truth incredibly brief, and even reaching 100 years of age is rare. Yet people still scheme endlessly for future generations, while creating immense suffering through struggles for power and advantage. It is precisely selfish greed that has caused countless cruel conflicts throughout the world, robbing humanity of true serenity and genuine happiness in life. The Buddha taught that if one wishes to live peacefully, one must practice contentment and simplicity, because the greater the craving, the greater the growth of wrongdoing and mental suffering. A person who never learns contentment will still feel poor while surrounded by gold and jewels, whereas someone who knows sufficiency can experience noble peace even while eating a simple, humble meal. Reflecting throughout history, all glory, wealth, and worldly honor eventually vanish with time, and there is truly nothing lasting enough to justify endless struggle and attachment. If people create heavy evil karma because of ambition and greed, then in the end, only disgrace and suffering will remain, following them across countless future lifetimes. Far better, therefore, to abandon greed and desire early, free oneself from bondage to fame and competition, and return to seeking the wondrous truths of life, karma, and the cycle of rebirth. When one truly understands this truth, life naturally becomes gentle and peaceful, filled with a noble happiness that no amount of gold or worldly treasure could ever purchase. There was once a landowner who possessed vast fields of white hemp, a plant whose fibers would become dark and worthless if not harvested at precisely the proper season. When harvest time arrived, the landowner had to hire a great number of laborers to work continuously, day and night, in order to pull the hemp before it spoiled, making the entire season extremely busy and urgent. One noon, while the cook was preparing a large pot of delicious meat soup for the exhausted workers, a hawk suddenly flew overhead and dropped its filth directly into the boiling pot below. The cook became horrified and wanted immediately to remove the impurity, but it was already too late, because the filth had dissolved completely into the large cauldron, and preparing another meal would delay everyone's lunch. He thought to himself that such a tiny amount of bird droppings mixed into a huge pot of soup probably would not affect the taste very much, and so he silently continued serving the meal to all the workers. The labourers had spent the entire day working hungrily beneath the sun, and therefore they ate joyfully and with great appetite, completely unaware of the impurity hidden within the soup. Only the cook, because he alone knew the truth, felt deep disgust within his heart, and had absolutely no desire to taste even a small portion of the soup himself. The workers noticed the cook refusing to eat and assumed he was generously saving the best portions for others, so they enthusiastically placed meat into his bowl and urged him warmly to join them. The cook reluctantly swallowed a few bites, yet inwardly he felt none of the pleasure experienced by those who remained ignorant of the contamination while happily enjoying the meal. The Buddha used this story as an analogy for the state of mind possessed by Buddhas and noble saints when they manifest within this impure and suffering world in order to rescue deluded beings. Although such enlightened beings appear in human form, live among ordinary people, and participate outwardly in worldly life, inwardly they remain completely unattached to the fleeting pleasures of existence. The Buddhas and awakened ones resemble the cook who clearly understands the impurity hidden within the soup, and therefore Though they move among worldly pleasures, no craving or attachment arises within their hearts. This Saha world is itself filled with suffering and impurity, and even the human body is nothing more than a temporary gathering of impermanent and unclean elements. Yet deluded beings still cling to it as though it were beautiful and lovable. Human beings endure endless hardship merely to feed, clothe, and indulge the body, only to continue suffering further through struggles for fame, wealth, and sensual attachment. Everyone knows that attachment to beauty, wealth, and status leads to affliction. Yet people still find it difficult to let go, because without such things, life seems empty and cold. Thus, most people eventually accept suffering as though it were happiness, and impurity as though it were purity, forever spinning within the endless cycle of craving, without finding a path of escape. Out of compassion for these deluded beings, the Buddha manifested within the world, taking on an ordinary human body and entering society so he could gradually awaken souls still sleeping within desire. He abandoned all luxury and royal splendor within golden palaces, keeping only the bare necessities required to sustain life, while dedicating his entire existence to guiding countless beings toward liberation. Once the true impermanent and impure nature of worldly existence becomes fully understood, the awakened mind naturally loses interest in the hollow pleasures over which ordinary people endlessly compete. The Buddha stands as a radiant example of one who lived amidst worldly dust while maintaining a mind completely pure and untouched by temptation, fame, desire, or sensual attachment. More than 25 centuries have passed, yet humanity continues revering the Blessed One, because he truly embodied the noble path of dwelling within the world without becoming stained by it. The ancients once said that although saints are born among humanity, their minds always rise above the lowly attachments and impurities of ordinary worldly existence. What matters most is not whether one lives within forests or crowded cities, but whether one can preserve inner purity without allowing the dust of the world to cloud the luminous mind. Anyone capable of living amidst society without being dragged away by greed, hatred, and delusion gradually draws nearer to the serene liberation attained by sages and saints. There is also a story concerning Venerable Nanda, the Buddha's cousin, who at that time lived in Kapilavastu and remained deeply infatuated with his extraordinarily beautiful wife. One day, the Buddha arrived at Nanda's home, seeking alms, precisely while Nanda was carefully adorning his wife, causing him to hurriedly tell her to wait only a moment while he greeted the Buddha. Nanda came outside, bowed respectfully before the Blessed One, and accepted the alms bowl to carry inside for filling with food offerings. Yet, when he returned, the Buddha unexpectedly refused to take the bowl back. Nanda then attempted to hand the bowl to Venerable Ananda, but he too declined and gently replied that whoever receives another person's bowl must personally return it to the rightful owner. Deeply embarrassed and confused, Nanda had no choice but to carry the bowl while following the Buddha back toward the monastery, with a heart filled equally with reluctance and bewilderment. The moment they arrived, the Buddha instructed a barber to shave Nanda's head and ordain him into monastic life, causing Nanda to react with intense anger and resistance at such an unexpected turn of events. Nanda even loudly threatened that if anyone dared shave his hair, he would incite the entire city of Kapilavastu into rebellion, frightening the barber so much that he dared not move. Seeing this, the Buddha personally stepped forward and stood beside him, and Nanda, filled with both reverence and fear, finally no longer dared resist and reluctantly accepted ordination. Although he had now become a monk, Nanda's mind still remained day and night attached to thoughts of his beautiful wife, and he constantly searched for opportunities to escape back home, without any sincere wish for liberation. The Buddha clearly understood Nanda's thoughts, and therefore often kept him close at his side, preventing him from finding any opportunity to return home and visit his beloved wife. One day, it became Nanda's turn to remain behind and care for the monastery, while the Buddha and the monks went out for alms, and he became secretly delighted because he believed he could finally sneak home unseen. He hurriedly carried water to fill all the jars and quickly attempted to lock the monastery doors before departing. Yet, strangely, each time he closed one door, another door suddenly swung open again. Nanda struggled endlessly, yet could not secure everything properly, and his frustration only grew stronger, while his longing to return home and see his beloved wife became increasingly intense. At last, he decided to abandon the doors entirely and instead sought a hidden shortcut where few people traveled so he could avoid encountering the Buddha while rushing home in eager attachment. Yet, after traveling only halfway along the road, Nanda suddenly saw the Buddha appearing directly before him, causing him to panic and hide quickly behind a large tree to avoid being noticed. Because of overwhelming fear and embarrassment, Nanda finally emerged and stood before the Buddha, then silently followed him back to the monastery with a heart full of longing and unease. The Buddha gently asked whether Nanda still loved and missed his beautiful wife so deeply that he could not devote himself peacefully to spiritual practice. Hearing this, Nanda honestly revealed all his inner feelings, admitting that although he now wore monastic robes, his heart still remained completely attached to his beautiful wife and worldly affection. The Buddha did not scold him, but instead compassionately led him to the top of a high mountain, where an old, blind female monkey wandered helplessly among the lonely bushes. The Buddha pointed toward the monkey and gently asked Nanda how the beauty of his wife compared with that creature, causing Nanda great discomfort, though he remained silent and offered no reply. Deep within his heart, Nanda felt upset because he believed the Buddha had used such an ugly image to compare with the wife he loved and adored so passionately. At that very moment, the Buddha used his spiritual power to bring Nanda on a journey through the heavenly realms of the 33 gods, whose splendor surpassed anything ordinary words could possibly describe. Everywhere stood magnificent palaces made of radiant jewels, where heavenly beings and countless celestial maidens of breathtaking beauty enjoyed lives filled with joy, peace, and long-lasting happiness. Nanda gazed in fascination upon the marvelous heavenly scenery, and soon noticed an especially splendid palace where 500 heavenly maidens were waiting. Yet, strangely, there appeared to be no heavenly lord residing there. Filled with curiosity, he asked the Buddha why such a magnificent palace lacked a master like the others. But the Buddha only smiled gently and encouraged him to ask the heavenly maidens directly. Nanda approached the palace and inquired why no heavenly lord ruled there, and the maidens replied together that they were waiting for him himself to arrive and become their celestial lord. Hearing this, Nanda became overjoyed and eagerly introduced himself, explaining that he was presently traveling through the heavens with the Buddha and wished to remain there immediately. The heavenly maidens replied that such a thing was not yet possible, because they were celestial beings, while he was still an ordinary human, and only through diligent spiritual cultivation and rebirth could he later join them there. After returning to the human world, the Buddha asked Nanda how the beauty of his wife compared with the heavenly maidens of the celestial realm. Nanda answered honestly that beside those heavenly maidens, the wife he had once adored now seemed no different from the old blind monkey the Buddha had shown him earlier. From that heavenly journey onward, Nanda began practicing discipline and cultivation much more diligently than before, because he longed to be reborn among the heavens and enjoy happiness with those beautiful celestial maidens. When Venerable Ananda noticed this, he recited a verse reminding Nanda that a practitioner seeking heavenly pleasures was no different from a goat being led away while still imagining itself headed toward happiness. The Buddha understood clearly that although Nanda had become diligent in practice, his motivation still lacked true purity, and therefore he continued using skillful means to awaken him from this subtle attachment. One day, the Buddha brought Nanda directly into the hell realms so he could witness with his own eyes the horrifying punishments beings endure because of the evil karma they themselves create. Nanda saw countless cauldrons of boiling oil, where sinners were submerged amidst screams of unbearable agony, terrifying him so deeply that his entire body trembled uncontrollably. Amidst that horrifying scene, he noticed one especially large cauldron being fiercely heated by demonic guards. Yet, strangely, there was still no sinner suffering within it. Filled with fear and confusion, Nanda asked the Buddha about the empty cauldron, but the Blessed One simply instructed him to ask the guards standing watch nearby. Trembling with fear, Nanda approached the guards and asked why that cauldron remained empty, and they coldly replied that it had been specially reserved for him in the future. They explained that although Nanda would first enjoy heavenly blessings because of his ordination under the Buddha, his mind still remained attached to sensual pleasure, and therefore, after exhausting heavenly merit, he would fall into hell and suffer within that very cauldron. After hearing this, Nanda became utterly horrified, his entire body turning cold as he desperately recited the Buddha's name and begged to be saved from such dreadful suffering. When they returned to the monastery, the Buddha asked whether Nanda still wished to seek heavenly pleasures, and Nanda immediately knelt down, declaring that he now desired only freedom from samsara and no longer craved celestial delights. Seeing that Nanda's heart had truly transformed, the Buddha compassionately taught the Dharma in order to awaken wisdom within him and reveal the impermanent nature of every realm within the three worlds. From that moment onward, Nanda cultivated himself with complete sincerity, abandoned all sensual attachment, and within a short time attained arhatship, becoming fully liberated from birth and death. This is much like two farmers cultivating fields side by side, for even if both sow seeds and care for their land equally, different seeds will naturally produce entirely different harvests. Even when the same seeds are planted, one who diligently nurtures the field and another who remains careless and lazy will never reap identical results at harvest time. At first, Nanda had been forced into monastic life against his wishes, and within his heart he longed only to return home and resume his life of attachment and romance. So naturally his spiritual practice could not bear authentic fruit. Because the Buddha understood Nanda's capacity perfectly, he first used heavenly pleasures to encourage him toward moral discipline, then revealed the suffering of hell so he could recognize the danger hidden within sensual craving. Through these skillful methods, Nanda eventually awakened a genuine aspiration for liberation, instead of merely seeking pleasure within heavenly realms. All Buddhist teachings explain that the 6 realms of rebirth and every karmic consequence within the 3 worlds arise entirely from the thoughts and mental states created by living beings themselves. Those who uphold moral precepts yet still cling to attachment, hatred, and resentment must continue returning to the human realm in order to repay karma and continue learning the path. People attached to superstition, worldly blessings, and external displays of divine power without overcoming delusion are easily reborn among the asuras, where conflict and endless competition prevail. The 3 lower realms of hungry ghosts, hell beings, and animals arise from overwhelming greed, hatred, and ignorance, which manifest as painful karmic consequences. The Buddha once taught that although the ocean is vast, it possesses only a single taste, the taste of salt. And likewise, his Dharma contains only one flavor, the flavor of liberation from birth and death. Seeing clearly that human life is filled with aging, sickness, death, and the impermanence of all material things, the Buddha opened a path leading beings beyond this endless cycle of suffering. If those who study Buddhism have not yet developed the great compassion required to vow liberation for all beings, they should, at the very least,
sincerely aspire to free themselves from the painful bondage of the three worlds. That alone becomes the true and proper motivation for spiritual cultivation according to the liberating path taught by the Buddha. Because if one's intentions remain misguided, then no amount of effort can truly free a person from the cycle of rebirth.